April 1943. High above the French countryside, the sky was a clear, piercing blue. From his cockpit, Luftwaffe Lieutenant Franz Keller adjusted the throttle of his Focke-Wulf 190 and let out a chuckle over the radio. Below him, a group of unfamiliar American fighters struggled upward, their thick frames shimmering in the sunlight. "They look like flying milk jugs," he muttered, his voice muffled through the oxygen mask. His wingman laughed with him. To German eyes, these new machines were an absurd sight, fat-bodied, short-winged, and slower to climb than the Predators of the Reich. They didn't seem to belong in the same sky as the razor-sharp Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. What Keller did not realize not yet, was that those ungainly aircraft, the P-47 Thunderbolts, were about to rewrite the rules of the air war. The very planes that made German pilots grin with contempt would soon leave them stunned, their cockpits shredded by storms of lead, their airfields burning under relentless attack. How could something mocked as clumsy become one of the deadliest fighter bombers of the entire Second World War? Was it American engineering genius? Was it the sheer willpower of the pilots who learned to master it? Or was it something larger, an expression of America's overwhelming industrial muscle? In the next hour, we will trace the unlikely story of the Thunderbolt, from its troubled beginnings, to its baptism of fire, to the moment when even the Luftwaffe's aces realized they were facing a machine built not for elegance, but for dominance. Along the way we will hear the voices of pilots who flew them, the disbelief of enemies who fought against them, and the legacy they left behind. Imagine for a moment that you are in Keller's place that spring morning. You see those huge American fighters below. Do you laugh, certain of an easy kill? Or do you hesitate, sensing something you cannot yet name? By the end of this story you may find your answer. And before we begin, if you want to uncover more hidden stories of World War II aviation, make sure to subscribe to this channel. That way you'll never miss a new episode. And let me ask you directly, in your view, what decides an air war, pilot skill, or the weight of industrial firepower? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Now let us turn back the clock to the first days of the Thunderbolt's creation. The Republic Aviation Company was not the largest aircraft manufacturer in America, but in 1940 it carried the weight of ambition. Led by Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer who had fled Europe in the 1920s, the design team faced a daunting challenge. The U.S. Army Air Corps needed a fighter that could survive the brutal new realities of war. The lightweight designs of the 1930s were already obsolete. What was required was something tougher, something that could climb to meet bombers at high altitude, endure punishing dives, and above all, bring its pilot home. Kartveli's answer was radical. He envisioned a machine built around one of the largest engines ever fitted to a single-seat fighter, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial capable of more than 2,000 horsepower. To make the most of it, the aircraft needed a complex turbo-supercharger, mounted not in the nose but deep within the fuselage, with ducts and pipes winding like veins through the body of the plane. The result was an airframe far bulkier than anything then flying in Europe. When the prototype, designated XP-47B, rolled out in 1941, its sheer size astonished onlookers. It weighed nearly twice as much as a Spitfire. Its cowl was so broad that mechanics joked it could hide a small car inside. Its nickname came quickly, Jug, short for Juggernaut, though some said it was because it resembled a milk jug lying on its side. At first glance, the Jug seemed a contradiction. Fighters were supposed to be slim, agile, elegant. This machine looked ungainly, almost comical. Yet those who studied it closely began to see something else. Its cockpit was armored like a knight's helmet. Its fuel tanks were lined with self-sealing rubber. Its structure could absorb punishment that would tear lighter aircraft apart. And its wings carried 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, enough firepower to shred any opponent if the pilot could bring them to bear. Still, the P-47 faced skepticism, even within the ranks of the U.S. Army Air Forces. Some commanders feared it would never match German fighters in a turning battle. Pilots climbing into the cockpit for the first time remarked on how enormous it felt. Compared to the nimble P-40s or sleek British Spitfires, the Thunderbolt seemed more like a flying tank. The Germans, when they first encountered it, laughed. From the cockpits of their Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, they saw the Jug as an easy target. Sluggish to climb, heavy on the controls, slow to respond. For a time those assumptions seemed justified. Early Thunderbolt units struggled with teething problems, from engine reliability to communication systems. Missions often ended with pilots frustrated, unable to keep pace with their British allies. But there was something deceptive about the Jug. Beneath the ridicule, beneath the first impressions, lay qualities that would soon prove devastating. Its great engine gave it unmatched speed in a dive. Its heavy frame meant it could absorb hits that would have destroyed lighter fighters. And its altitude performance, once refined, would allow it to challenge the Luftwaffe where it mattered most, high above occupied Europe in the path of the American bomber streams. One American pilot later recalled his first combat flight in a Thunderbolt. "It felt like strapping myself to a bull," he said. "It wasn't graceful, but if you rode it right, nothing could shake you off." As 1943 unfolded, the Thunderbolt squadrons were preparing for their baptism of fire. The Germans still laughed, still mocked the fat American planes. But laughter has a way of fading when the first bursts of gunfire arrive. The question was no longer whether the Jug could fight. The question was how quickly it would earn its place in the deadly hierarchy of the skies. By the spring of 1943, the American daylight bombing campaign over Europe was gathering momentum. The doctrine was bold, almost reckless. Bomb German industry by day in tight formations, relying on defensive firepower to break through. The British had already abandoned daylight raids after suffering catastrophic losses, choosing instead to strike at night. But the U.S. Army Air Forces believed precision bombing in daylight was the key to crippling the Reich's war machine. There was one problem. Bombers, no matter how well armed, could not protect themselves indefinitely against the Luftwaffe. The swarms of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs tore into the B-17s and B-24s with devastating effect. Losses mounted, morale wavered, and it became clear that without long-range escort fighters, the bombing campaign might collapse before it achieved anything. Into this crucible stepped the P-47 Thunderbolt. At first, its range was limited, barely enough to escort bombers deep into France, let alone to the industrial heartlands of Germany. But for the missions it could cover, the Jug became the spearhead of American fighter operations. The baptism came in April 1943, when the 4th Fighter Group, veterans of the Eagle squadrons who had flown with the RAF, took the Thunderbolt into combat for the first time. Expectations were uncertain. Some pilots grumbled about the aircraft's weight and sluggish climb. Others believed its toughness would make it the best friend a bomber could have. The first clashes were tentative. German pilots, spotting the new machines, dove in with confidence. They had fought Spitfires, P-40s, Hurricanes, and knew the rhythms of those duels. But the Thunderbolt confounded them. In head-on attacks, its 8 guns spat out torrents of .50 caliber fire, creating a lethal cone that even the most seasoned Luftwaffe ace hesitated to cross. In diving pursuits, the Jug displayed a terrifying advantage. It simply did not stop accelerating. A German pilot could bank and roll, but if he tried to escape in a dive, the Thunderbolt followed like a hammer falling from the sky. One Luftwaffe report in mid-1943 remarked, almost with surprise, that the new American fighter was fast in descent, with great firepower. The mockery had not yet ended, but cracks were forming in German confidence. For the American pilots, the baptism was equally revealing. They quickly learned never to dogfight a Messerschmitt in tight turns. The Jug was too heavy, too slow in roll. But if flown to its strengths, diving, climbing back with momentum, using its durability, it became a predator. Aerial combat in a Thunderbolt was not a dance of elegance. It was a contest of brute force. A young pilot of the 56th Fighter Group described his first victory. "I lined up, squeezed, and the guns just kept pouring out shells. I didn't fire bursts, I fired rivers. When the German passed through it, there was nothing left to fight." The baptism of fire also tested the Jug's durability. Pilots returned with stories that seemed unbelievable. A P-47 limped back across the channel with half its tail shredded. Another came home with a cylinder blown out of its massive engine, still running on the rest. Mechanics shook their heads, then patched the machines up and sent them aloft again. Slowly the fighter began to earn the respect of those who flew it. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, was discovering that its laughing dismissals carried a price. In July 1943, when Thunderbolt groups began sweeping deeper into occupied Europe, German pilots who tried to exploit its supposed sluggishness found themselves caught by its diving power and outgunned by its 8.50s. Losses began to climb. The once invincible aura of the Jagdwaffe faced a new, stubborn adversary. But the true test was yet to come. The bombing raids were pushing further beyond the Thunderbolt's early reach. Until the range problem was solved, American bombers would bleed. And the question hung in the air: could this hulking beast of a fighter adapt quickly enough to save the campaign? By late summer, modifications were already underway. Drop tanks extended the Jug's legs. Pilots refined tactics, learning to work in pairs and squadrons, covering each other in slashing dives rather than fruitless turn fights. Every mission brought new lessons written in smoke across the skies of France. The baptism of fire was over. The Jug was no longer a curiosity or a joke. It had proven it could kill and survive and return. What lay ahead was its transformation from a mocked outsider into the backbone of Allied air power. And in that transformation, the laughter of German pilots would fade into silence. By the late summer of 1943, the Thunderbolt was no longer a stranger to combat. Its pilots had endured the steep learning curve, and squadrons that once doubted the machine now began to exploit its hidden strengths. War in the air is rarely kind to slow learners, but the Thunderbolt survived its apprenticeship. And in doing so, it created something the Luftwaffe had not anticipated: an enemy that refused to die easily. The range issue remained a pressing concern. Bomber crews flying into the Ruhr or deeper into Germany often had to press on without their P-47 Guardians. But with the arrival of external drop tanks, first crude belly tanks, then improved wing-mounted versions, the Jug's reach expanded. Slowly, it pushed beyond the coastlines of France, into the contested skies of Belgium and Germany itself. The pilots who flew these extended missions soon discovered that the P-47, if handled wisely, was a hunter. It was not built for delicate maneuvers but for decisive strikes. Tactics evolved accordingly. Instead of circling endlessly with Messerschmitts, Thunderbolt squadrons favored the boom and zoom approach. Dive at speed, unleash a torrent of fire, then climb away on the power of the massive R-2800. In such attacks, the Jug's weight became an asset. Gravity was its ally, speed its shield. Few men embodied this shift more than Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, leader of the famed 56th Fighter Group. Zemke understood that the Jug was not a Spitfire and not a P-51. It could never win a turning duel against a Bf-109 flown by an ace of the Eastern Front. But it could dive like no other, and it could take hits that would shred a lighter aircraft. Under Zemke's guidance, the group developed tactics that turned the Jug from a liability into a terror. His pilots became some of the deadliest in the European theater, scoring hundreds of victories while flying the aircraft that had once been ridiculed. One of those pilots, Francis Gaby Gabreski, would go on to become America's top ace in the European theater, with 28 confirmed kills, all achieved in the P-47. Gabreski later reflected that the Jug demanded discipline. If you tried to fly it like a Spitfire, you were dead. But if you flew it like a Jug, fast, heavy, diving, you had the edge. The German response was mixed. At first, they continued to underestimate the Thunderbolt, treating it as little more than a slow American brute. But as pilots like Gabreski and Zemke racked up victories, respect began to creep in. Reports filtered back to Luftwaffe command of Thunderbolts shrugging off cannon hits, of Jugs that refused to fall even with their wings riddled. One German ace reportedly remarked, "It was like fighting a flying fortress with one engine." Meanwhile, the Thunderbolt was carving a reputation not only as a fighter but as a shield. For the bomber crews who flew into Germany, its bulky silhouette became a symbol of hope. A formation of Jugs overhead meant that the ambushes of FW-190s would be met with answering firepower. Pilots of the 8th Air Force began to trust their big friends, and the once derided machine became a morale booster. Still, the transition was not without blood. Escort missions were grueling, and the Luftwaffe, though stretched thin by commitments on the Eastern Front and in the Mediterranean, remained deadly. German veterans, many with hundreds of missions behind them, knew how to draw inexperienced Americans into fatal mistakes. The Thunderbolt's weaknesses in climb rate and roll speed could not be hidden. Pilots who forgot Zemke's lessons often paid with their lives. But the tide was shifting. Every month more Jugs arrived. American industry was hitting its stride, producing aircraft in numbers the Reich could scarcely comprehend. By the end of 1943, the Luftwaffe faced a cruel arithmetic. Each German loss cut deep, while the Americans could replace aircraft and pilots with relentless speed. The rise of the P-47 aces symbolized this transformation. Men like Gabreski, Robert Johnson, and Dave Schilling became legends not because they flew the most graceful fighter, but because they mastered its unique power. Johnson's story in particular circulated widely. Hit by cannon shells, his Thunderbolt barely holding together, he still managed to limp home across the channel. Mechanics counted more than 20 holes in the fuselage. Johnson himself later said, "I thought she was finished, but the jug kept flying." By early 1944, the laughter that had once greeted the P-47 was vanishing from German radio chatter. The jug had proven its worth. It could not yet reach Berlin on escort duty, that role would soon fall to the long-legged P-51 Mustang, but in the battles it did fight, it earned the grudging respect of friend and foe alike. The evolution was complete, from mockery to experiment to lethal reality. And with the rise of its aces, the Thunderbolt was no longer just an aircraft. It was a symbol of resilience, of American adaptability, and of the grim reality facing the Luftwaffe. The war in the air was entering a new phase. And the jug, armed with 8 guns and the determination of its pilots, was ready to carry it forward. By the spring of 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had already proven itself in the air. It could shred German fighters with its 8 heavy machine guns, it could dive faster than anything the Luftwaffe could field, and it could bring its pilots home even when riddled with holes. But in war, machines evolve with necessity. And the Allies were about to need something more than just an escort fighter. They needed a hammer to smash German strength on the ground in preparation for an invasion that would decide the fate of Europe. The jug was uniquely suited for this brutal new task. Its radial engine, tough and air-cooled, gave it survivability against small-caliber ground fire that liquid-cooled German fighters lacked. Its wings and fuselage were strong enough to carry bombs and rockets without compromising performance. And its machine guns, already devastating against aircraft, could chew through trucks, trains, and even lightly armored vehicles. Slowly, the P-47's role expanded. What began as a high-altitude guardian now descended low, roaring down roads, railways, and fields across occupied Europe. Pilots quickly discovered that the jug could deliver more firepower than many bombers. Each wing could carry a 1,000-pound bomb, while the belly rack could hold another 500-pounder. Later versions were fitted to fire 5-inch rockets, essentially flying artillery shells. Add in the 8 machine guns, each firing at 800 rounds per minute, and you had an aircraft capable of leveling an entire column of vehicles in a single pass. Imagine the effect on a German convoy winding its way through the French countryside in May 1944. A low drone becomes a thunderous roar, and suddenly a formation of Thunderbolts tears across the sky. Machine guns hammer, bombs tumble, rockets streak. In seconds, the road is littered with burning trucks, shattered wagons, and overturned half-tracks. Survivors dive for cover, only to hear the jug circle back for another pass. For ground troops, this was not just an attack, it was a nightmare from above. What made the P-47 so terrifying in this role was not just the weaponry, but its ability to sustain punishment. Anti-aircraft fire was a constant threat. German forces deployed thousands of flak guns along transport routes, from the dreaded 88mm cannon down to small-caliber automatic weapons. Yet the Thunderbolt, more often than not, survived. Pilots told stories of limping home with wings riddled like sieves, with cylinders blown out of the engine, with chunks of the tail missing. If a pilot had to fly low into the teeth of German defenses, there was no aircraft he trusted more than the jug. By June 6, 1944, D-Day, the transformation was complete. Over 500 P-47s participated in the invasion, providing continuous cover for Allied troops storming the beaches. They strafed gun emplacements, bombed strong points, and destroyed German reinforcements rushing toward Normandy. One German pilot, one of the very few who even managed to reach the invasion area, later admitted, "The sky was filled with them. At every height, wherever we looked, Thunderbolts." His unit of a dozen fighters lost all but one aircraft in a single attempt to break through. For the Wehrmacht on the ground, the jug became a constant menace. Reports from panzer units described entire armored columns reduced to twisted wreckage after repeated attacks. Rail networks, once vital for moving men and equipment, became death traps. In the weeks following the landings, Thunderbolts destroyed thousands of locomotives, trucks, and horse-drawn wagons. German soldiers coined nicknames for the American fighter, some mocking, some fearful, but the one that stuck was simple: Jabo, short for Jag Bomber, the fighter bomber. Yet statistics alone do not capture the psychological effect. Survivors of ground units described the distinctive roar of the P-47's engine as a sound that chilled the blood. Veterans who had faced tanks, artillery, even Soviet air attacks admitted that the Jug was different. Its assaults were relentless, its weapons overwhelming. The phrase Jabo fever entered German medical reports. Cases of soldiers breaking down at the mere rumor of Thunderbolts in the area, refusing to move in daylight, suffering physical symptoms of stress before missions. The Allied High Command quickly recognized the strategic value. With P-47s roaming the skies, German movement during the day became nearly impossible. Entire divisions were forced to travel only at night, slowing their ability to reinforce against the Allied advance. Fuel shortages grew worse, not just because of bombing of refineries, but because tankers and supply trains could not reach the front without being annihilated by Thunderbolts. Even hardened Luftwaffe aces were not immune to the shift in perception. One veteran of over 200 missions wrote in his diary in early 1944, "The fat Americans no longer climb like cows. They dive like hawks and their guns tear our machines to pieces." Another later admitted after the war, "At first we laughed. By 1944, when I saw the Thunderbolts above, I felt only dread." And yet, the Jug was not done evolving. Newer models with paddle blade propellers increased climb rates dramatically, erasing one of its early weaknesses. Extended-range versions carried drop tanks that allowed them to follow bombers deeper into Germany than ever before. Each improvement turned mockery into respect, respect into fear. By the time the Allies broke out of Normandy, the Thunderbolt was no longer just a weapon of air superiority. It was an extension of Allied artillery, a mobile, flying barrage that could be called upon to strike bridges, tanks, troop concentrations, and even individual vehicles. Infantrymen who fought through France came to see the Jug as their constant companion, their shield in the sky. For them, the sound of its guns was not terror but salvation. So, how did a machine once mocked as clumsy and overweight become the scourge of the German army? Was it simply a matter of American industry, or was it the brutal logic of combat proving that survivability and firepower matter more than elegance? The answer lies in the wreckage left across France. Columns destroyed, locomotives shattered, convoys obliterated. The Jug had found its true purpose. But the war was far from over. Ahead lay the Ardennes, the push into Germany, and even encounters with a new kind of enemy, the jet fighter. Could the P-47, a piston-engine brute born of 1940, stand against the sleek promise of the future? That challenge was coming, and once again the Jug would have to prove itself. By the winter of 1944, the Allied armies had clawed their way across France, liberated Paris, and pushed toward the borders of Germany. For many the end seemed near. But in December the quiet forests of the Ardennes erupted in fire as the Wehrmacht launched one last desperate counterattack, the Battle of the Bulge. It was here, in the freezing skies above snowbound villages, that the Thunderbolt once again proved its worth. The German offensive relied on surprise and speed. Columns of panzers, trucks, and infantry pushed through the narrow roads of the Ardennes, aiming to split the Allied armies and recapture vital ports. At first, poor weather grounded Allied air power, and the P-47s sat useless on their airfields, engines silent, wings iced over. American ground forces bore the brunt alone, and the German tide rolled forward. But when the skies finally cleared in late December, the Jug returned with a vengeance. Thunderbolts swooped over the snow, their machine guns tearing through convoys, their bombs and rockets blasting tanks apart. Pilots remembered the smoke rising through the forests, the flashes of white snow stained black by burning fuel. For the soldiers fighting on the ground, those attacks were salvation. One infantryman later said he would never forget the sight of P-47s strafing ahead of him, clearing the road that no artillery could reach. The Battle of the Bulge revealed the Jug's dual nature. It could duel with fighters when the Luftwaffe appeared, and it could descend to treetop level to savage columns of armor. German tanks were formidable, but even they were not safe. A rocket or a well-placed bomb from a Jug could disable a Panther or a Tiger, and if not destroyed outright, the surrounding trucks and fuel carriers would ignite, leaving the armored giants stranded and helpless. For the Luftwaffe, the Ardennes offensive was a final gamble. Their fighter wings, depleted and exhausted, threw themselves against overwhelming numbers. Pilots with years of combat experience now faced American flyers with only a handful of missions. Yet the balance of numbers, fuel and industry was gone. The skies above Belgium and Luxembourg swarmed with Jugs, Mustangs and Spitfires. Every German loss was irreplaceable. Every American loss was met by another machine flown in by ferry pilots the next day. And then, as if to underline the passing of an age, a new threat appeared in the skies over Germany. Sleek, swept-wing aircraft with engines that shrieked instead of roared, the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. For the first time since the war began, American pilots faced an opponent that could outrun them not by a few miles per hour, but by a wide margin. In level flight, the Jug could not hope to match it. The first encounters were shocking. Thunderbolt pilots described the silver darts flashing past, climbing away with impossible speed. Dogfighting was out of the question. Yet the Jug had an answer, one born not of elegance but of grit and patience. Jets were fast, but they were vulnerable at 2 points: during takeoff and landing. Their engines, primitive and temperamental, required long runways and slow acceleration. Thunderbolt squadrons soon learned to loiter near airfields, diving in when jets struggled to gain altitude, catching them before they could unleash their speed. It was not a fair duel, but war rarely is. And in those final months, the Jug added jets to its long list of conquests. Pilots who once feared the Me-262 learned that discipline and teamwork could bring them down. Stories spread of Thunderbolts catching jets low over forests, their 8 guns spitting fire until the miracle machine spiraled into the ground. Meanwhile, the ground campaign surged forward. Every mile deeper into Germany brought more bridges, more rail yards, more convoys to destroy. The Thunderbolt became a weapon of constant pressure. German cities echoed with the distant thrum of engines, factories struggled to rebuild, and soldiers on the front line looked to the skies with dread. The war was becoming a war of exhaustion, and the Jug was one of the instruments grinding the Reich into dust. As spring of 1945 arrived, the Luftwaffe was broken. Fuel was gone, pilots were scarce, and airfields were little more than targets waiting to be cratered. Yet the Thunderbolt kept flying, strafing, bombing, escorting, always present. In the ruined landscapes of Germany, its reputation was carved into memory. For American pilots, it was no longer the butt of jokes, no longer a question mark. It was the machine that had carried them through the darkest skies. And for German soldiers and civilians, the Jug was unforgettable. The sound of its guns, the sight of its bulky frame diving from the clouds, the sudden eruption of fire on a railway line or a highway, all became symbols of the relentless power closing in on the Reich. The laughter that had greeted its first appearance was gone, replaced by silence, by resignation, and at times by awe. By the end of the war, the Thunderbolt had flown more than 500,000 combat sorties in Europe. It destroyed thousands of locomotives, trucks, and tanks, and claimed tens of thousands of enemy aircraft both in the air and on the ground. Its pilots had become some of the most respected aces of the war, and its legacy was sealed in both blood and victory. Yet even as peace approached, one question lingered: how had such a machine, dismissed as overweight and ungainly, become one of the most feared and effective fighters of the war? Was it the power of American industry alone, or was it the stubborn resilience of a design that refused to fit expectations? Perhaps it was both. The Jug had survived mockery, survived combat, survived the rise of the jet age itself. And as Germany collapsed in May 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt flew overhead, still roaring, still fighting until the very end.